Welcome to Tradies Who Lead, the podcast about everyday leadership for everyday legends. I'm Ashley Beltecki, a diesel mechanic by trade and your host. On the podcast, we share how every tradie can practice leadership in their role, regardless of their title or experience. In each episode, you'll hear from tradies across all industries about how they apply leadership skills and mindsets in the trades, so we can learn from them and level up our leadership on site. In this episode, we cover how relationships are the foundation of leadership success and how to get the best out of people in both their technical and team performance. Today, we're joined by Matt Wyatt, a trade qualified leader with over 30 years in the heavy vehicle industry. He started as an apprentice and worked his way through operational and national leadership roles across dealerships and OEM networks. For the last 15 years, Matt has been focused on one thing: developing people. By building capability, lifting performance, and designing training that actually sticks for technicians, service advisors, and parts teams. What makes Matt's perspective worth listening to is where he sits, right at the intersection of the frontline reality and structured development. He knows what it's like on the tools, and he knows what it takes to build the systems and standards that help people grow beyond them. His approach is straightforward: clear standards, strong accountability, and no fluff. If it doesn't work on the floor, it doesn't belong in a program. Matt is also passionate about strengthening apprenticeship pathways and actively working to bring more women into the trades, believing the future of the industry depends on widening the gate without lowering the bar. Outside of his day-to-day role, he contributes to national learning and development committees, helping shape vocational education across Australia. If you've ever wanted to understand what it takes to build a high-performing team from the ground up, this is a conversation you'll want to stick around for. Thanks for joining me on the podcast today, Matt.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
So, starting at the beginning, what does leadership mean to you?
I think really it's about setting the standard. I think people, especially in a workshop space, watch our leaders far more than what they say. And I think if you walk past something, whether it's poor workmanship, bad behavior from someone taking shortcuts, and you don't say anything, I think that's where you're setting a standard. And I think it's not walking past those things. It's really about your relationships. So people are far more likely to follow someone that they trust and respect rather than someone who sits above them on an org chart. And I think in your last podcast, Les was talking a lot about those sorts of things, of being asked to do something that he knows that his manager at the time wouldn't have done themselves. And I think that really resonated with me, and that's really critical. Leadership's something that you're constantly working on. Every generation's changing and the next generation's different to the next generation. So you're constantly having to adapt and change. There's still a lot of people in this industry that are still operating the same way they did 30 or 40 years ago, but I think they're getting left behind, and they're probably missing some great people or not getting the best out of people because they're not adapting their leadership. And I think at the end of the day, for me, it's not really about the title, it's about how you act and what you do.
So, setting boundaries and leading by example, but also having lines in the sand as well as part of that.
Absolutely. People look to you. If you're in that leadership role, people are looking at you when things go wrong, and it's how you deal with that and what that environment is that you create. When I was an apprentice, and I think watching some of the leadership that I had at the time probably started to shape my leadership. I probably had some pretty poor leadership, I think, when I first started. And I don't think that's indicative of the people that I was working for at the time. I think it was just more on the fact that they didn't have the tools to become leaders. And I think that kind of set my standard in a very different way early. And I think I mirrored some of those behaviors. And I'm not sure really whether they were the greatest thing. I certainly have learnt a lot on my journey with that because I mirrored some of those things myself. And they weren't great. And I think, I was fortunate enough to be able to move through roles like a lot of people traditionally do in our environment, where sometimes you're the last person standing and you get the tap on the shoulder to step up. And more times than not, you're not actually equipped to do the job. And I kind of progressed my way into leadership through there. And I think there's so many people in trades that have progressed that way. I think it's an area where the trades as a whole could do a whole lot better in terms of prepping people for those leadership roles.
I imagine there's people who listen to the podcast who are in formal positions, or they might even just be a tradesperson who's trying to show some leadership with an apprentice or a junior person. What would you say is the tool that was most useful for you to actually be able to influence people to potentially do what you wanted them to do?
I think my biggest mistakes were thinking that I suppose respect comes with the position or that authority, and that people would automatically respect your leadership because you were given a manager title. And early on in my career, I really struggled with that. I struggled to get people to do what I wanted them to do at times. There was probably a lot of heated conversations, and the leadership that I'd had prior was kind of like that military leadership. You just did what you were asked without questioning it. And so that's kind of where I just picked up and ran with it. And I think the world was starting to change, and that wasn't leadership anymore. And it really challenged me because I didn't actually have any tools to pull back on. And so sometimes it might have been shouting louder. I thought that would get the message across. I mean, it doesn't work, right? But I didn't know. I cringe, and I think I might have shared a story with you before, but I ran into a tech that worked for me at 2 a.m. in a Melbourne street after a night out, and he told me I was the worst boss he'd ever had. Look, he was right. I was terrible, and it was just a realization that you need to hear sometimes.
It's a really powerful insight, and I can appreciate that any relationships or any kind of clear communication and having those conversations, that it's so hard when we're so under the pump in the trades.
I think relationships play such a strong part, and I think that's something that I've gotten better with over my career is just building those better relationships with your staff and getting a better understanding, I think, of their strengths and weaknesses and knowing what are the right things to be asking them to do. And I know sometimes you don't have the luxury of 200 people to choose from to make sure that everyone's doing the right job. But I think clarity around what your expectations are also critical. And sometimes it's knowing for the staff to know what that end goal is. What are we trying to achieve here? And having that clarity and making sure they understand it. Because I talk to people a lot. No one comes to work to do a bad job, right? So a lot of the time it's communication or that lack of clarity in what they're trying to do and that lack of understanding. So that's been one critical goal. And I think that having clear expectations, and I love to share with my teams what our bigger picture is, what our longer term goals are. What are we trying to achieve here? Is it growth? Is it consistency in the work that we're putting out? Like, what are the things that we're focusing on? And I think when you're sharing that, it helps get them engaged and get them on board.
And so many tradespeople are in firefighting mode where they're just trying to go from problem to problem and put those band-aids so that we can get through the day. What does it actually take to step out of that cycle of constantly fighting fires?
Oh, it's a great question. And look, I see it so often, and in service departments are the worst at it. And I think sometimes we love the adrenaline of bouncing from one fire to another, right? It keeps us going and it keeps the day moving quickly. And I'm sure that I've got some managers that I work with today that I've talked about this quite often, and I think they love it. But I think a lot of the time, for me, it's systems and processes that are breaking down. If you're seeing the same issues over and over again in the same areas, there's something fundamentally wrong with your systems or your processes. I think sometimes we're just too scared to press pause and actually take a moment to look at it. And we're just so busy jumping from one fire to the next that we never get that opportunity to stop and actually try and work out what's causing it. I hear it all the time, oh, we're too busy to do that. And it's like, yeah, but you're spending so much time firefighting that you could actually get that time back and reinvest it in something more valuable, like fixing your processes so you're not having the same thing and you're not having to do, X, Y, and Z's jobs for them because maybe they haven't been trained properly and we haven't been able to work that out because we haven't stopped to actually have a conversation. We're just constantly fixing the issue.
I really like that example because I often think about even myself being in business and managing this podcast and the other types of projects I have going on. It is so much easier to be busy and not actually take the time to have the critical thinking time or have that critical conversation with that person. But you bring up training as well as part of that. And I imagine that sometimes when it's not the system or the process, it might be having that conversation or doing that coaching with someone who's maybe not understanding the system or process that they need to be following. And you do a lot of work in that structured training space. When it comes to training people, how do you actually deliver support and training that gets retained and applied long term in the workplace?
It's a constant challenge. I don't think there's any one magic silver bullet. And I think a lot of people look to training to deliver that silver bullet that will send people off for a 2-day training course and they're going to come back as a much new and improved employee and we're going to see these huge benefits. But I think for us, we try and spend a lot of time understanding our operations and what the pressures are on the operations so that we can try and target the training to add value and to help alleviate some of these problems. So I think in my role at the moment, that's one of my keys is how can we help the dealerships to train their people on some of the things? Because as we were just discussing, the managers of firefighting, they're constantly jumping from one thing to another. So they don't have the time to sit down and spend this. So this is where I think I'm really fortunate in my role now is that we can start to work with the managers to look at that stuff. But if we move into the technician side for us, the tradie guys, like, man, you got to cut the BS out of it. You got to cut the PowerPoints out. It's got to be hands-on and practical to what they're doing. And look, we're refining what we do, and we're constantly trying things. And look, we've tried some stuff lately, and we haven't always got it right. But I'm a firm believer that it's better to try something new than to just keep doing the same thing, like the old definition of insanity. Just keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. You've got to try new things and try and engage people in different ways. And everyone learns differently and everyone engages differently. So it's trying to find a blend that it's hard because you've got to try and find a blend to capture everyone and keep everyone engaged. And that's where I think even having great trainers is really critical, that they can adapt and flex and be able to go off script and go down rabbit holes and explore things where it's adding value. You're not having to stick to a curriculum and tick some boxes. It's got to be fluid and dynamic.
I find that for a lot of businesses, and most likely probably the medium to smaller businesses that don't have the infrastructure of a large business like yours, that the key source of this training tension is around apprentices. And I know there's a lot of businesses that can get quite frustrated with how their apprentices are progressing from a skill point of view, and they don't often recognize the role they have in terms of how they've approached and mentored and created those learning experiences. So what would you say from what you see from technicians and apprentices across the different dealerships that you oversee? What are the main mistakes that leaders are making in terms of developing those apprentices or helping those teams develop their apprentices?
I think there's a few. The business pressures, we tend to expect to get better productivity efficiencies, be able to sell more of their time too early. I think those KPI metrics weigh heavily, and I think that dilutes some of that training time where I think maybe a workshop may get busy. So we may just grab the second year to throw them onto that job because we need to get it out quickly and they may not be ready for that. So I think a lot of the times, although we're trying to do the right thing, we're not helping them create that safe space to learn. The other key is just having people that they can work with that are wanting to work with them and help develop them. Not everyone's a born trainer and not everyone's a born leader and not everyone wants to work with an apprentice. And we need to recognize that. And I think there's still room for those people to be able to help apprentices, but maybe you're not having them buddied up with them for a month at a time where they're not learning. I think those two things are really critical. And I think that on the job learning and just trying to remove some of that pressure off the apprentices early really helps them to grow and develop. And I think allowing them to make mistakes in a safe space, I think is also critical. I'm sure most of the people that are listening and most of the people you talk to have been through a trade, right? And I'm sure we've all got stories of the things we've stuffed up as an apprentice, and you learn from it, right? Like, I mean, I still dwell on stuff that I did, a long time ago, dumb mistakes that you make, but you never make them again. So you need to be able to make those mistakes. I think it's critical to make them, to learn from them.
It's interesting you bring up the challenges from the way businesses or even like the industry is designed and how that puts pressure on the people within a team. It kind of creates constraints around some of these things like building relationships or coaching someone before they actually get put in a situation without being thrown in the deep end. And I know for myself as a tradesperson and a lot of tradespeople that kind of get off the tools into any sort of management or leadership role, it's very easy to be frustrated being such practical people sometimes in systems where things don't change quickly, and it's easy to get frustrated and blame the system and give up. So what does it actually look like to influence change as a tradesperson who's moved into maybe one of those office roles without waiting for someone maybe higher up in the business or higher up in the system to fix it?
I think this is a pretty common thing, certainly in the auto heavy space. I think you see this a lot. One of my things is I'm kind of like asked for permission later, do the forgiveness thing. So a lot of things I like to make the call, and being empowered to do that helps a lot. A lot of the times I see people aren't coming up with a solution, they're presenting problems. And I think that's where I think the empowerment, they play hand in hand, right? When people can come to their supervisor or their manager with a problem and a solution, it really helps them or the manager that is, to make the decision, and it makes their life easier. And I think as you're coming up through the ranks, it's something that I think we don't promote enough, is trying to empower people to come up with a solution. Go into any workshop and you can probably talk to some techs and they can give you 100 reasons why something's not working. But what are we going to do to fix it? How do we fix it? And having those ideas and those discussions around those improvements and how we make them. And I think that helps build and flow into leadership. We're sort of on a bit of a journey with continuous improvement at the moment. And part of that is having these, 10-minute start of shift improvement meetings where people can have some input, and trying to foster that culture in the workshops of that idea of the people with natural leadership skills can really start to feel empowered and start to grow and develop in that role. And it helps guide them and give them that a little bit of confidence moving forward, because that transition is always so tough when you're coming off the floor into that supervisor or leadership role. And most of us, we don't have the tools in our toolbox for that, because generally we're doing the training after someone's maybe been in a management role for 6 months and they're struggling. Oh, geez, we need to give Matt some training, instead of training me ready for the role. So, yeah, I think those sorts of things really help a lot.
Now, the work you do has been across national levels and many dealerships, and you mentioned before about maintaining standards and having that accountability. I can appreciate that when you're communicating and building relationships, that might be one way that you maintain those standards even when you're not in the room. But I know for a lot of trade businesses, they're often sending their workforce out to different sites, whether that's residential or commercial, and they don't necessarily have that direct oversight of what's going well and whether things are being done the way they expect them. How do you maintain those standards, or what are your practices, I guess, to verify that those standards are upheld, even when you're not in the room or that environment long term?
I'm not necessarily saying I get it right all the time, but the vision and the goals and making sure everyone's aligned with that and understanding it. And even if you've got different points of view, you can put that aside because you're working to a common goal. I think for me, being in some of the national roles, it's always great to have a person in that dealership that's really fully on board that you can rely on. But again, that's not always the case. But that clarity around the vision of what we're trying to achieve. And then I think as you grow in time in those roles, it's your relationships with those people. And I remember I had a guy working for me that was really struggling to get some engagement with people in one of our stock, and he wanted me to intervene at the time. And look, I offered to do it, but I said, look, I can make the call and get this done, but it's not my position that they're doing it for. It's my relationship that they're doing it. And so my recommendation to him was to spend more time with these people and build the relationship, because that's where you get your favors from, right? It's not because I've got a title and I sit above them. It's because I've got a relationship and I can ring up, have a conversation, ask for a favor, and you've got to return those favors sometimes. It's building those relationships. That's really critical, and that just being transparent, like sharing when you've made mistakes with your teams around the country. And we're all human and we all make mistakes, and it's that openness that really helps. And you don't always get it right, and there's always going to be some friction in workplaces with people, but hopefully you've built that, at least the healthy respect, that you can disagree but the end goal's still the same and we can get on and we can achieve what we need to achieve.
It's a really powerful example of how far investing in relationships can get you. It's also sometimes the hardest part of the job. Sometimes it's easier just do the work, and like the problems we would fix on machines or on sites or on buildings can feel like a straightforward process. So we fix them, where developing people definitely doesn't feel straightforward. So what keeps you invested in developing people and investing in them in so many ways after so many years and challenges?
When we're doing the training stuff, I love being able to see people have that aha moment when you actually finally get through on something. I think that's great. And you might only get one every couple of months, but it's really rewarding when you do that, or when you get that one person that's really bought in and really engaged in what you're talking about. I think that's great. And even just like on the coaching and mentoring side, it's being able to see the growth in an individual over a number of years and where they grow and develop. It's that relationship stuff, right? You've built that rapport with them. A lot of the time, it's great to be able to have those hard conversations with them, to talk about shortcomings. And likewise, they're not always comfortable when you have those conversations, but if they're coming from the right place, you can learn a lot from them. And there's still quite a few people that I'm connected with that I've worked with and helped grow and develop, and they've moved on to bigger and better things. And I love connecting with them and hearing their stories of their success. It's nice to feel that you've even if it's a small impact on something that you've been a part of that journey for them. So I think that's what helps me get up in the mornings and be excited to come to work.
It sounds like it's really powerful when we can have an impact intentionally and help someone else grow. Now, the final question I ask all our guests on the podcast is, what would be your advice to tradies about how they can practice leadership every day, no matter their title or how many years experience they might have?
It's not a title. Being a manager doesn't mean you're a leader. I'm sure all of us have worked for managers that are far from leaders. And I think it's demonstrating that in the workplace every day. And I know, like on the workshop floor, you see those people in the workshops, right? Like, you know who the leaders are. They're the people that you go into when you've got problems. They've got the solutions. They hold the standards, right? Whether it's flat out and you're under the pump, they're not feeling that pressure as such to cut corners and to take shortcuts to try and get the result. They know how long things take to do, and they do it right. I think they're the values of that leadership. I think they're the people that don't get caught up in the politics and the crap that goes on the shop floors sometimes, and they just rise above it. And I think you really see them when the pressure really comes on. They go to another level, or they stay at that level that they're at. They don't waver. Their commitment, their quality, it's always there. And there's always those 2 or 3 people that really demonstrate it. And a lot of the time they're not in leadership roles, but they control that shop floor, and they are the ones that people go to.
It's a really powerful example of how any of us can show up as a leader, and we don't need to wait for a title or even rely on a title in the future. It's really about relationships, but also the way we connect with people. And you've shared a lot of really powerful tools, but also some of the lessons you've learned from mistakes looking back on where you started. So thank you so much for everything you've shared, Matt. I know I got a lot from today's chat, and I know the listeners will as well.
Oh, you're welcome. I mean, I think I work with a guy and he loves to say every day is my school day. And I think it's true, right? Like, every day we're learning something. And I mean, I don't think your leadership journey ever ends. I think it's ever evolving. So yeah, really great to chat. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another tradie diving into how they practice leadership on the ground. If you enjoyed today's insights, tap like, subscribe to Tradies Who Lead, or follow us on socials for more stories from the voices you hear on the show.